May 19, 1836, Texas Fort Parker. A scene of brutal violence unfolds as a 17-year-old girl is forced to witness her father-in-law fall victim to a war club and her mother-in-law succumb to stab wounds, left bleeding on the ground. Before she can react, the young woman, 6 months pregnant, is seized by warriors and thrown onto horseback. Her name is Rachel Plummer, and what awaits her over the next 21 months is an ordeal so horrific that she will later struggle to articulate it fully, even within the confines of her published memoir written in the sanctuary of her father's home. She offers only a glimpse into her experience. To undertake to narrate their treatment would only add to my present distress. For it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less speak or write of it. Rachel Plummer's story is not unique. Instead, it is echoed in the experiences of countless women abducted from frontier settlements by native tribes across the American Southwest during the 19th century. Some were fortunate enough to be ransomed back to their families after months or years of intense negotiation. Others, seizing opportunities amidst chaos, managed to escape and undertake arduous journeys of hundreds of miles to return to so-called civilization. Tragically, the majority of these women were never seen again, and those who did manage to return bore the indelible scars of their captivity, haunted by memories they could scarcely recount. Newspapers of the era, known for their graphic reporting of public hangings, often hesitated to publish the full extent of these women's experiences, acknowledging the profound depths of their suffering. These accounts are not mere frontier legends but are substantiated by documented evidence, sworn court testimonies, and memoirs authored by the survivors themselves, sold to readers eager to understand the realities of life in the wilderness. This content will present these narratives without flinching. These stories deserve to be told because what comes next is essential history. The pattern of these raids remained consistent. Warriors typically struck at dawn or dusk, exploiting moments of low visibility when families were most vulnerable. Isolated homesteads, situated far from neighbors and assistants, were prime targets. The men of the household, husbands, fathers, brothers, sons old enough to wield a rifle, were typically the first to be killed, often within minutes of the attack. There was no parley, no warning, and no compassion, only swift action. Following the initial assault, a selection process began. Women of childbearing age were particularly valuable, prized for their capacity to work, be traded to other tribes, or sold into the burgeoning slave markets operated by Mexican traders in the northern territories. They could also become wives, bearing children who would be integrated into the tribe. Young girls under the age of 10 were also highly sought after, as they could be raised within the tribe, eventually losing all memory of their former lives, adopting the language, customs, and identities of their captors. The elderly and infants met a different fate. Considered liabilities due to their inability to contribute through labor or procreation, they slowed down the raiding party's retreat and risked detection. Infants, whose cries could alert pursuers, were often killed without hesitation. This selection process was marked by its calculated efficiency, utterly devoid of sentiment. Olive Oatman was only 14 years old when warriors attacked her family near the Gila River in Arizona in February 1851. The Oatman family was traveling westward with a group of settlers, but following disagreements, they decided to continue alone, convinced they were close to safety. This decision proved fatal. Olive witnessed the brutal deaths of her father, mother, older sister, and baby brother, all murdered within minutes while she stood frozen in terror. Only Olive and her 7-year-old sister, Marianne, were spared. The warriors dragged the two sisters into the desert. Olive later recounted walking barefoot through the wilderness for an entire night, enduring the pain of sharp rocks cutting her feet and cactus spines piercing her skin. Deprived of food, water, and rest, she was beaten with clubs each time she faltered from exhaustion, forced to continue despite her injuries. Her little sister walked beside her, wounded and terrified, too exhausted to cry out. By dawn, Olive's feet were so lacerated and swollen that each step felt like walking on shattered glass. Yet, she pressed on, knowing that stopping meant certain death. And this marked just the beginning of their ordeal. Upon arrival at the tribal camp, captives immediately began their new lives. They were not treated as guests awaiting rescue or prisoners awaiting ransom, but as the property of their captors. Women were put to work without delay, even before their wounds had healed, or they had received adequate nourishment. Their days were filled with arduous tasks such as gathering firewood until their hands were raw and bleeding, carrying heavy vessels of water for miles under the scorching desert sun, scraping animal hides until their fingers were numb, digging for edible roots in the parched earth, and hauling loads that would tax even a grown man. They were given the most undesirable and physically demanding tasks, ones that members of the tribe were unwilling to do themselves. They ate last, consuming whatever scraps remained after the tribe had finished their meal. And in times of scarce food, they went to sleep hungry, only to wake before dawn to resume their relentless labor. Rachel Plummer described her first months among the Comanches. "I was kept constantly at work from earliest dawn until late at night. When I failed to perform my tasks to their satisfaction, I was beaten with clubs and sticks. My life was one of constant dread, suffering, and misery. Beatings were frequent and often arbitrary, inflicted for working too slowly, showing signs of exhaustion, crying out in pain, or speaking English to another captive. Sometimes, they occurred for no discernible reason, simply because the captives were vulnerable and powerless, and there were no repercussions for their abusers." Olive Oatman spent a year as a slave among the Yavapai before being traded to the Mojave tribe. During that time, she and her younger sister, Mary Ann, were pushed to the brink of death, subjected to regular beatings and meager rations, and exposed to the harsh elements of the Arizona desert. Mary Ann, only 7 years old, could not withstand the abuse, starvation, and relentless labor. Her body began to deteriorate, growing weaker with each passing day. Olive watched helplessly as her sister faded away, her spirit extinguished, and the vibrant child she once was reduced to a mere specter. She was powerless to save her. But what truly broke these women was not merely the physical hardship, nor the constant hunger. It was what happened when they failed to obey, or sometimes when they did nothing wrong at all. Matilda Lockhart, a 13-year-old farmer's daughter, was captured by Comanches in Texas in 1838. She endured 2 years of unimaginable suffering before being returned during peace negotiations in San Antonio in March 1840. Upon seeing her condition, Texan authorities were rendered speechless. Hardened frontier men, accustomed to violence, stood in stunned silence. Mary Maverick, who helped bathe and dress Matilda after her return, recorded in her diary the horrors she witnessed. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores. Her nose was actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. Matilda, barely able to speak above a whisper, recounted the torment she had endured. The women of the tribe had made a game of torturing her, waking her from sleep by pressing burning sticks to her face, with her nose as their preferred target. Night after night, week after week, month after month, her screams provided amusement. The smell of her burning flesh elicited laughter. Eventually, there was nothing left to burn. Her body was covered in similar marks, burns on her arms, back, and legs, bearing the mark of systematic cruelty. Mary Maverick wrote that Matilda was utterly degraded and could not hold up her head again. Matilda Lockhart never fully recovered from her captivity. Her body was too damaged, her spirit too thoroughly broken, and she died 2 years after her rescue at the age of 15. Fire was a tool readily employed by the tribes. Captives were sometimes staked to the ground and burned slowly over small fires, prolonging their suffering for hours. This practice was typically reserved for male prisoners or as a message to enemies. More commonly, fire was used as a form of daily discipline. Heated metal was pressed against the skin, burning coals were placed on arms and legs, and sticks were pulled from campfires and pressed against faces to wake captives or punish them for minor offenses. The smell of burning flesh became a familiar aspect of their existence. The most horrific use of fire occurred as a collective punishment as revenge after the Council House fight in San Antonio in March 1840, where Texan authorities killed several Comanche chiefs during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. In retaliation, the tribe staked 13 prisoners to the ground, building small, controlled fires around them, designed to maximize suffering over an extended time. The process took hours. Matilda Lockhart's younger sister, who was 6 years old, was among them. When another Comanche band arrived weeks later to negotiate, they brought a survivor who recounted the events, every detail, every scream. The message was clear: cross us, and everyone you love will suffer in ways you cannot imagine. Consider the plight of these women, farmers' wives, daughters, mothers, and children, taken from their homes and subjected to years of relentless suffering. Some were held for months, others for years, and some for decades. What would you have done in their place? How long could you have endured? One more trial faced by captives was the ritual known as running the gauntlet, designed to break their spirit from the very beginning. The captive was forced to run between two long rows of warriors armed with clubs, sticks, whips, and anything else that could inflict pain. Each person in those rows struck them as they passed. The goal was simple: survive. Those who reached the end still standing were considered to have passed the test. Those who fell were beaten until they rose again. Those who could not get up faced worse. The gauntlet served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for the tribe, celebrating a successful raid. It was a demonstration of the captive South's new place in the world and a means of breaking their spirit. It served as a test of courage. Those who displayed resilience, who refused to cry out, who kept running despite the pain, sometimes earned marginally better treatment. Those who showed weakness invited further abuse. Rachel Plummer wrote about enduring the gauntlet multiple times during her 21 months of captivity. She discovered that showing pain only encouraged more violence, that crying only made them hit harder. They respected bravery more than anything, she wrote. I wish I had known it sooner. By the end of her captivity, Rachel had learned to fight back. When one of her captors attacked her, she retaliated with such force that the warriors lived on in approval. They admired her spirit, her refusal to be broken. From that day forward, her treatment improved. Most captives never learned this lesson. They remained victims, growing weaker until they died in captivity or were ransomed. Some women faced a different fate altogether. They were taken as wives. This status provided protection from random acts of violence and a defined role within the social structure. However, these women had no choice in the matter. Young women were bestowed upon warriors as rewards for successful raids and expected to fulfill all wifely duties. Resistance led to violence until resistance ceased. Some eventually accepted their new lives because acceptance was the only way to survive. Cynthia Ann Parker was captured at age 9 during the same raid that took Rachel Plummer. She spent 24 years among the Comanches, learning their language, customs, and beliefs. She married a war chief named Peta Nakona and had 3 children, including Quanah Parker, the last great chief of the Comanche people. By all accounts, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, her children, and the life she had built. When Texas Rangers finally tracked her down in December 1860, she resisted rescue, begging to stay with her family. They took her anyway. Her husband was killed. Her sons escaped, and she never saw them again. Only her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, accompanied her into captivity. For Cynthia Ann, the rescue was a second captivity. She spent the remaining 10 years of her life trying to return to the Comanches. She was watched constantly, guarded by family members who thought they were helping her. She died in 1870, heartbroken. Some believe she simply stopped eating after Prairie Flower died of influenza. She chose death over a life among people who were now strangers to her. The brutal nature of frontier captivity becomes glaringly apparent when looking at what happened to children. Rachel Plummer's 2-year-old son, James, was taken from her arms during the raid on Fort Parker. She never saw him again during her captivity. Her second child, born 6 months into her captivity, was also taken from her. They took my child from me. I never saw him alive again, she wrote. She was 20 years old. Rachel Plummer was eventually ransomed. When her father saw her, he barely recognized his own daughter. She was emaciated, covered in scars, and her eyes reflected something that hadn't been there before. She wrote her memoir and became pregnant again and gave birth to a son. She died 2 months later. Her son, James, was eventually ransomed and returned to the family in 1842 at the age of 8. He had spent 6 years among the Comanches, enough time to forget his birth family. Olive Oatman was released after 5 years with the Mojave tribe where she was adopted, given land to farm, and tattooed with their sacred marks. She was still a captive. When she walked into Fort Yuma in 1856, she weighed barely 80 pounds and struggled to speak English. Across her chin, 5 blue lines announced that she had been marked by another world. Olive became famous, touring the country and publishing a book, becoming a symbol of frontier survival. She married a cattleman and lived quietly in Texas, but she never fully recovered. Her husband spent years burning every copy of her memoir, trying to give her peace. She kept a jar of Mojave mesquite seeds on her shelf until the day she died. By the 1870s, historians estimate that at least 30% of Comanche, Kia, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. The line between settler and native was more nuanced than Americans wanted to believe. Some captives assimilated, learning the language fluently and adopting customs. When rescue parties found them, some captives refused to leave. They had become someone else while others endured years of horror and left as shells of who they had once been. They could never explain to their families what had happened because the words simply didn't exist. And thousands simply disappeared. The frontier was not a place of heroes and villains but a place of survival where everyone committed acts that haunted the land for generations. Women who survived captivity carried their experiences forever in their scars, silences, and things they couldn't bring themselves to write even years later. Rachel Plummer wrote that some things were too terrible to describe. Olive Oatman's blue tattoo announced her history to everyone she met. They survived and left behind testimonies that force us to remember what the American frontier was, a nightmare that lasted for generations. History calls these women victims, yet they were also survivors and witnesses who tell us what happened in the places the rest of America preferred to forget. Their stories, suffering, and courage matter.